All right, hey everyone. My name's Aaron Wright. I'm a clinical professor here at Cardozo. I also run Cardozo's blockchain project. I just wanted to welcome you to Cardozo, and I wanted to especially thank Mary for putting together this wonderful program. Here at the law school, we've been deeply interested in legal technology and how technology will impact the law, and it's our pleasure to be able to host these types of events. So thanks for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to Mary.
Okay, well, I wanted to start off by thanking Aaron. It's like the Mutual Admiration Society up here, but thank you to Aaron for inviting us back. We've been here, I think, 2 other times, so maybe this is the 3rd time. But what's really interesting is we had an event almost 2 years to the day here. It was our first official Evolve Law event in New York. We had done the evening before our first official event, which was in Boston, which is where I think I met Bennett and Cognate. So we're really excited about some of the things that are now happening with above the law. I've been explaining this. I was just at Cleo's conference, so I've been explaining this over and over again, that I've actually merged the companies and call it Evolve the Law. But so I actually had 3 people tell me that that's actually a really good name. So maybe, I don't know. It's over to you. So we are super excited to have Evolve Law join forces with Above the Law, and what that means for our members is a huge increase in reach, and the community that we've built over the last couple of years has now grown. It's over 120, or I can't really totally keep up. I know I have a lot of podcasts to do in the next month with the new members, so there's quite a few. And the stories that people have told us about what's come out of this has been really gratifying, because it's not just, although sales are important, it's also about the connections that are made and the strategic partnerships between the members. We actually had an acquisition of one member of through Evolve Law. So it's very exciting. And so tonight we're going to talk about data and analytics. That's our little tagline. I think most people here might know what Evolve Law is, but we're this community for legal innovation. And we really want to focus, our theme is going to be for 2018, is going to be talking a lot more about adoption. Because we've talked a lot in the last 2 years about a lot of theoretical things, but then a lot of technology, and I think that's great, but we want to really, one of our themes, it won't be our only theme, but one of our themes is actual adoption and what's going right and what's not going so well. So our Darwin talks are usually 5 minutes, but we wanted to thank Wolters Kluwer, who's our sponsor this evening, along with Cardozo Law. And so we've given Dean a bonus 5 minutes. So he is doing a 10-minute Darwin talk, and we're really excited to have him come up and talk to us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the extra 5 minutes. I think that's actually a reflection of the fact that the last 5 minutes didn't go quite into 5 minutes, but we'll see. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about a historical perspective of artificial intelligence. And so, why would I have a picture of Bob Marley up here? Well, I think, first of all, I always love to promote good musicians when I can, but the quote I hear is, in this great future, we can't forget our past. For those of you who don't know who Bob Marley is, he's a reggae musician, or was a reggae musician based out of Jamaica. This quote was reflective of the fact that there were a lot of political changes going on in Jamaica, and it was impossible to understand those without looking at the context of that which came before. And I think the connection that you get into with artificial intelligence is that I think it's very similar. I don't think you can really understand where we're at with AI without really having a sense of what has happened heretofore. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I think it's a good topic if you Google robot lawyer or whatever have you at this point in time, you get a bevy of articles come back. There's endless speculation about what's going to happen, whether lawyers are going to be here or not. I say this is the topic. I would say blockchain is probably the other topic, and perhaps the more hot topic at this point in time. But it's still a very hot topic. But I think it's important to realize that this is not something in artificial intelligence that just actually happened overnight. In fact, artificial intelligence, the term, is older than I am. I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but AI was coined in 1956 at a conference in Dartmouth, that was the term, and there was a lot of funding and optimism about it changing the world at that point in time. And in fact, I have a quote here from 1970 from Life magazine from a professor at MIT who talks about the fact that in 3 to 8, or his opinion, 3 to 8 years, they'll have a machine with the intelligence of a human being. Well, those of us who lived through that period of time know that things didn't quite come to pass that way. And what you saw is you saw a sense of disappointment that we weren't getting through the optimistic projections that occurred, and they had what they called an AI winter, which is a takeoff of the term nuclear winter. And then you saw some resurgence in the 80s with the idea of expert systems at that point in time. And then those didn't quite deliver in the way that we thought they were going to, and you saw a second AI winter. And things started to turn probably in the mid-90s, about the time the internet boom started to gather a little bit of steam. And you saw IBM, in what was a brilliant marketing coup, if nothing else, finally built a computer called Deep Blue, which beat the world chess champion Garry Kasparov at the time. And that continued along, and we all saw Watson win Jeopardy at one point in time recently. And what you saw is that processing power, prevalence of data started to increase, and what you also saw is a shift philosophically speaking. When you think about expert systems, what we tried to do is we tried to program machines to think like people. And now what you see at this point in time is we've said, well, machines don't do that very well, but they process stuff very, very well. And so what we do now is we teach machines to brute force go through large amounts of data. And they do that very, very well. And that's been the shift that we've seen, along with some development of algorithms, that's really started to bring AI back into the core. To talk a little bit about the things that drove this, Moore's law roughly stated, every 2 years you have a doubling of processing power. And so you can see here, just on this graph, this is an exponential graph, you go back to 1950 forward, that's held. So this thing in my pocket here has a phenomenal amount of power compared to the machines that I went to college with. So much more powerful, it's incredible. The other thing that you see is that data has been cheap to store, become cheap to store. This is an exponential graph going the other direction. So when I went to college, again, I had an IBM XT computer, which had a 20 megabyte hard drive, which was about the size of a shoe, a big shoe. And that was really cool at the time. Now you get multiple gigabytes in tiny little SIM cards. So it continues to plummet also. And then that's important because we have a lot of data. You see, and this is the quote that was given to me, 2.5 exabytes of data created every day. Now I don't know what an exabyte is. It's a big number. What I've been told is it's about the equivalent of having 250,000 versions of the Library of Congress created every day. And we'll create more data in 2017 than we've created in all of recorded history. So you've got these three things going together. We can process data really well compared to what we used to be able to do. We can store it so we can track it, and we've got a lot of it to track. So what's the implication into law at this point in time? Well, broadly speaking, when you have a data set, you have an opportunity to apply some AI types of technology. And really, I think about two general goals. I want to do something faster. I want to be more efficient at doing something. And the second thing, I want to get to a better outcome for my client. If I can do those two things, I'm going to be successful as an attorney or as a law firm. I'm going to be more profitable. My business is going to grow. What types of legal data sets do we look at? Well, a lot of different things, and a lot of data that's out there. Traditional things like case law, dockets, court records, contracts and transactional law, the rules, the laws itself, patents, trademark, filing data, news content. There's a whole heck of a lot of data out there that one can go through. So I see three trends going on. The first trend, which is alarming to somebody like myself who works with a large vendor, is we see law firms disintermediating the vendors and investing directly. Partnering with people like IBM, with Ross Intelligence, or taking their own data, hiring data scientists, and building their own analytics around that. I got a couple examples that you see here. The next trend we see is a lot of the folks in this room, legal startups, legal tech startups that are employing AI technology, trying to break into the legal tech environment with large law, mid-sized law, small law. and a lot of success in those around the areas of document review, e-discovery in particular. And then the third trend that we see is, of course, the large publishers. Each of us have invested in artificial intelligence, albeit in different ways. C. Thompson has formed a partnership with Watson, Bloomberg is building their own, Lexis has bought analytics companies, and we're doing a lot of partnering ourselves to bring things to market. Now, any AI presentation is not complete without a picture of the Terminator robot. But I do have a word of caution here. So this is a concept called the hype cycle, which is a Gartner concept. And this talks about the idea that technologies start by being hyped up, expectations aren't met, we go into what they call the trough of disillusionment, and eventually we kind of moderate out to a productive use of that technology. I would argue right now that artificial intelligence is probably on just over the hump, and we're starting to roll into some missed expectations. I would argue that blockchain, which we're going to talk about in a little bit here, is probably on the ascension right here of expectations. And we get into these situations where the technology solves every problem, irrespective of what that problem is. And so I think that the danger that you get into with this is those disillusionment, the disillusionment of some of the promise starts to tar the image of the whole thing. And you've seen a change in the narrative already in the medical area with Watson, right? MD Anderson kicked Watson out very publicly and said some pretty nasty things about return on investment with them. And you're seeing things where we're not quite getting to what the hype is saying it's going to be. And the danger that you get into is that we may be going into another AI winter. I don't think that that's the case, but I think that is something that is a danger that's out there. I should technically have a Game of Thrones winter may be coming here, but I chose not to violate any copyright or things on there. So, but I do think that there's a couple things to remember, and this is kind of what we look at when we invest in any type of technology, be it artificial intelligence, be it blockchain, be it anything that we're doing, is that I think it all starts with a legitimate customer problem. You know, if we're a solution that's searching for a problem, we're going to have a very tough time convincing customers that we got to go after this. You start with a legitimate problem. My favorite one on this is Netflix. If you go back to the world where we had to go to the video store to rent things, we had late fees associated with that. The videos that we wanted were never there. Netflix came up with the idea of, hey, we're going to mail DVDs to you and come back. And it took off because it was a legitimate problem that was solving, albeit in an old school way through the mail. This was before they started streaming. And I think that the other thing that we find great success in is finding a client that wants to build this out. And I won't go through the whole concept of what's the early market versus the lagging market, but find customers that have been trying to solve this problem themselves and partner with them. And I think that if you can do those things, instead of AI winner, you'll get to another Bob Marley quote, which is a favorite of mine, which is that everything is going to be all right. Thank you very much, and I'm right at 10 minutes. So.
I think we should leave Bob Marley up for the panel. What do you think, instead of the... Thank you very much, Dean. And I wrote at the top of my paper, not during the panel, because the paper was up here, that blockchain is the new AI. That was something that somebody said at Clio. It might have been one of the Integra people. So tonight we're going to have a panel where we're going to talk a little bit about AI and blockchain and the data that's coming out of this and the analytics. And I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, kind of going down or starting with Susan. But that'll be the only time that we're kind of going through the panelists. And with the size of the folks that have shown up, why don't we make it kind of interactive? If people have questions, don't wait until the end. Just put up your hand and go for it. So, Susan.
Hi, good evening. I'm Susan Chase, and I'm Portfolio Director at Wolters, Kluwer, and I'm responsible for product development in the corporate and securities area.
I'm Bennett, Collen. I'm the founder of Cognate, and we help companies protect their trademark rights using blockchain.
I'm Houman Shadab. I'm a professor at New York Law School, also co-founder of Clause, and very interested and involved in all things smart contracts, blockchains, data, legal tech. Thanks for having me.
And my name again, I'm Aaron Wright. I'm an associate clinical professor here. I also direct the Cardozo's blockchain project. My sister calls me a unicorn. I'm a programming lawyer. I think there's about 50 of us. I've also been building out a legal technology platform called Open Law, which is really the first platform that enables you to take a normal agreement and then embed into it a smart contract to employ all the benefits and efficiencies of blockchain technology. So it's a pretty cool project.
Awesome. So this is our esteemed panel, and Houman's going to lead us off by telling us some context and definitions around some of the words that we keep throwing out. Now, Dean, of course, has done an excellent job on AI, but maybe you can delve into the others.
Yeah, great. I can scratch AI off my list. I wish I would have known. I would have saved a few hours today. Okay, thank you. That was a great conversation. And thanks for having me here, by the way, as well. I didn't see you at CleoCon. I was there, too. I think I walked by you for like a second, but you were very busy. So, hello.
Yeah, hello.
So there's definitely a lot of exciting technologies and growing these days. I think a lot of jargon that we hear being thrown around. So certainly definitions, if I can provide some clarity, I'd be happy to. I think maybe the first one is to talk about blockchain. Blockchain is really a type of distributed ledger system in the sense that, or in contrast to a centralized ledger, so a central housing or central entity in the traditional default sense will keep a record of transactions and what transactions are true or valid. What distributed ledger technology makes possible, in a sense for the first time, is to have the same, or maybe even better, security and verifiability or immutability of transactions and trust without having to trust a central party in the classic sense, like a bank or a clearinghouse or maybe an accountant, right, to keep tracks of various kinds of records in the most general sense of any kind of, in theory at least, financial or business transaction. And a blockchain is a type of distributed ledger that achieves that same goal of verifying transactions, keeping records up to date and consistent and secure without a central party by using a certain type of software system that orders transactions into blocks, and using certain types of cryptography ensures to quite a high level of certainty that all of the transactions are valid, verified, and verifiable, and typically, at least in the default sense, will be public in some sense. So they can be verified in that sense. And the most sort of well-known blockchain is Ethereum. Is Bitcoin, and the second most well-known one I think is Bitcoin.
You just describe the future.
Yeah, maybe the future. Maybe that was a Freudian slip, but there's certainly two very important ones: Bitcoin and Ethereum. Two very, in some sense, very similar public open blockchains. There are private ones as well, such as the Hyperledger project, and private in the sense of they have various degrees of permissions for entities to be involved in writing transactions and to reading transactions and to verifying them as well. Another sort of more private type of blockchain is, or distributed ledger, that's not a blockchain actually, is something like the Ripple network. And finally, as a consequence of being a distributed ledger, in principle at least, it is a sort of global ledger, a universal database of records, and that's achieved as a consequence of being distributed. So if everyone or every, at least member of the network, the nodes, if they have a copy of that record, in that sense, that copy that's shared is a universal ledger, a universal database. And so people look at blockchains in terms of what problems are they trying to solve, to the extent that the people are trying to match up different records across different companies or across divisions within a company to overcome, let's say, problems of being siloed. People view distributed ledgers as being a solution to that kind of problem. And to the extent that, like, in the more public sense, perhaps even in a public or governmental sense, that governments are trying to make a single record that can't be changed, at least not very easily, of important governmental business records like land titles. People look to a distributed ledger or blockchain technology in that sense as well to use as opposed to, again, somebody's computer or some company's computer and their servers, and having to sort of trust them in many ways that we think about trust, both in a sort of technical sense and also in an operational risk sense as well. So if the software is operating correctly, if the incentives are there, and blockchains in principle offer superior record keeping functionality, but it may come with some costs as well in terms of power usage or in terms of regulatory goals that may not be as easily achieved under a distributed framework. So that's blockchain, I think, which should be crystal clear now. And so another one is, I think, maybe big data or data analytics that goes with it. And that's basically a buzzword that's, I guess, not as buzzy as it used to be, but maybe it still is.
That was the topic of our panel in 2015 was
Okay.
big data. So I
Yeah.
think it's on Dean's curve. I think it's not cool anymore.
Yeah. That's so maybe that describes me as well. I think I was
Sorry.
cooler in 2015, but big data is just as a consequence of the growth in information in society, and as a consequence of keeping all information and everything becoming increasingly digitized and recorded, whether it's your emails or where you're sitting right now because your chair has a sensor on it. There's been an explosion of data, right? We saw that, and certainly how that impacts lawyers, I think, is what we probably care the most about. So in data about your clients, your prospective clients, judges, juries, how they're going to make decisions, and ultimately just reading through all the information and literature of big data, I think that ultimately it's really trying to make, and especially for lawyers, I think, just make better decisions, make decisions data-driven, right? Should I appear on this panel? Or should I not, right? What's the data about the consequences of it historically? Kind of make a prediction about what's going to happen afterwards. So I think ultimately lawyers are certainly trying to improve their decision-making about what clients to take, how much time to spend on them, what price to charge them, and of course all other decisions that go into the toolbox of litigators or transactional attorneys or maybe more regulatory-oriented attorneys as well. So that's why I think when I read this, when the information literature about big data, about how that could impact legal practice, as well. I think that's
Aaron,
it.
did you want to talk a little bit about smart contracts?
Yeah,
Just define what it is?
Sure. So
For me, too.
So on top of, so that was a great description, and thanks again for inviting me to chat about this. So blockchains are not just a data storage system, but more advanced blockchains, particularly Ethereum, which Houman mentioned off the bat. They don't just store data; they actually store computer programs. And those computer programs are referred to as smart contracts. And they're a little bit different types of computer programs than what we're used to in the past. So they're computer programs that are run by multiple different parties. And what that means is that the computer programs are fairly autonomous. And that is particularly important in the context of certain commercial transactions. So you can program a computer program to do things like transfer assets, to facilitate payments, and you can trust, using a blockchain-based network, that those payments and those transfers will occur. So it prevents opportunities for opportunistic behavior, which if you're a lawyer, you know that there's plenty of opportunities where parties will try to back out of a deal or try to reinterpret a deal in ways that would be favorable in their interest, but not necessarily in the spirit or the intent of what the parties initially thought about. So a smart contract is basically just this little computer program that's really great at transferring assets that are secured on a blockchain. So that asset could be something like Bitcoin, that asset could be something like Ether, that asset could be something represented on a blockchain like title to intellectual property or something else like that. But you can begin, once you have these computer programs, to model out portions of legal agreements using computer code. That's pretty exciting. And you'd say, why would we really want to do that? Well, computer code is pretty precise, right? I can actually, if I program it purposefully and correctly, I can begin to do things really fast in real time. So we can build things like real-time payment systems or real-time transfers of assets. And since assets on a blockchain can be divided because they're digital, I can break them down into really, really, really tiny pieces. So we can begin to facilitate things like micropayments and begin to facilitate transactions related to that. And again, you may think, why would we need micropayments? Well, the answer is most things online are actually paid for in micropayments right now. So if you're streaming something on Spotify, you're effectively facilitating a transfer of 0.005 cents from Spotify to a label and to the various different publishing companies. If you're viewing an ad, those advertisers are paying micropayments effectively to the publishers. So we can begin to reimagine how we engage in commercial transactions and more seamlessly transmit payments and other things like that. And the other thing that you can do with these smart contract programs is begin to disintermediate certain functions. And a lot of these functions are quasi-legal in nature. So you may have heard about token sales. It's a little small program that's basically disintermediating what investment banks do in part, what accountants do in part, what other intermediaries that facilitate the sales of products do in part. So we're dramatically reducing the cost of selling things online by relying on these small little programs. And that's why there's so much excitement related to it. And that's why, frankly, it's whether there's hype or not, in the long run, we're going to see increasingly agreements that are not just based on natural language, but also in part written in source code.
Yeah, and so Susan, on that note, is this AI, is this blockchain, is this going to replace lawyers?
I think, first of all, as much as everybody or some people would like to see a world without lawyers, I do not think that's going to happen. At the end of the day, AI is just another tool in the lawyer's toolkit to help them work, to become more efficient. And it can't replace a lawyer's judgment. That's what they're being paid for. And even the best AI needs some human intervention there. In many ways, AI is making the lawyer's life better. It's doing very mundane tasks. Who wants to spend time going through 10,000 documents when you can use technology to do that in a much quicker and actually more accurate way? So what it really does is leave time for attorneys to spend their focus on the more bespoke, higher value work, and that's the work that our clients want to pay for. They don't want to pay for the lower value work. And that's the type of work that I think AI is going to help us move to the side and free up our time for.
Okay, and Bennett, did you want to comment on the impact that you have seen or are predicting with the blockchain and firm lawyers?
Yeah, so I think you can sort of start to extrapolate, based on what we've heard so far, where this is going. But I think it'll happen in three basic phases. First is going to be awareness. Second is going to be understanding, and then there's going to be competency. First, lawyers are going to become more aware of the blockchain, what it is, what it can do, similar to the general public, understanding if a client wants to do something interacting with the blockchain, whether that's use a smart contract for an aspect of their business or set up their stock certificates and their company ownership, their corporate structure through the blockchain, understanding what that means for their clients. And then second will be a more in-depth understanding once they're aware of what it is and just sort of being able to speak knowledgeably about a blockchain, really understanding what the implications are if an agreement is executed via smart contract. Is there any possibility for reversibility? What sort of things are you setting yourself up for? What are the specific terms of the smart contract around self-execution and payments and micropayments, sort of understanding the full scope of it. And then finally, I think there'll be sort of a competency or expertise in that area where there will be blockchain-specific practices or blockchain-specific practices within different aspects of the law, right? Because there could be a blockchain-specific IP practice, a blockchain-specific securities practice, because, as Dean said, it's not going to solve every problem in every arena, but specifically within the legal field, there are going to be a lot of different applications where blockchains are involved. And I think that, specific practices and attorneys with competency and expertise within those fields are going to start to pop up.
Okay, Susan, did you want to add something about in-house?
Yeah, I think on the in-house side, I think, again, I think blockchain is really new, and I think it's a question, does it live up to the hype or does it live up to its promise? I think if it does live up to its promise, it really can change the way contracts are made and enforced and the way they're handled within a company, making it much more efficient for corporate counsel to manage their documents and to execute and enforce them. So I think, there's a lot of promise there for the inside counsel within the corporation.
So now we can all sort of, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, to the point before, the law firms they're already on board. So I'm also the chair of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance Legal Industry Working Group. It's a consortium of about 300 different enterprises at this point in time. The Legal Industry Working Group has about 30 law firms. These aren't small law firms. They're top AM Law 100 law firms. So like Martel, Skadden, Davis Polk, Simpson Thacker. They're all interested in this because their clients are demanding expertise in this area. And there's a number of specific practice groups that have emerged. So I think lawyers just at baseline need a fluency for it. When it actually gets embedded into practice on a day-to-day basis, I think that there's a lot of prototyping going on. I think it's mapping out what are the true capabilities. And the way I've kind of conceived it, and I really think about it, is if you want to program an asset and program the transfer of an asset, that's what a smart contract's really great at. And that's pretty powerful. So things that you can set up with a smart contract are things like virtual escrow accounts. So you don't really necessarily need to have a trustee service to manage and hold custody of certain assets. You can just have that managed by this little autonomous program. So it seems like a fairly simple task, but there's a number of large businesses and financial services companies that's what they do. They basically are custodying assets on behalf of their clients. Well, maybe we don't need to use them anymore. We can actually begin to use these little programs to manage it because they do a better job. The second thing is, I'm sure you've all heard about how there's been a wave of cybersecurity attacks that impact law firms. And why has that happened? Because there are single points of failure in the system. They're storing documents. Those documents are very valuable. And so not surprisingly, hackers have been trying to obtain them so that they can trade on that information. That's a problem. And it's a problem because law firms are not particularly great at IT. Well, why should they be handling this? Why don't we instead use a blockchain as a way to actually facilitate a more decentralized way to store these agreements? So we can keep our agreements private and we can basically make it much, much harder for any cybersecurity attacks to occur. So I think we're going to see a lot with that. The third thing is that blockchains are fundamentally a chain of signatures. And signatures are really important to legal agreements. And right now, we have systems that are appending on signatures onto the contracting process. But in reality, we should be starting with e-signatures at the base and building up from there. That's in part what we do through our open law platform. So it's really that combination of starting with e-signatures, using a blockchain to store it, because it's a really, really permanent, fairly permanent database that's going to last a really long time. You pretty much can't shut a blockchain off. So a lot of these blockchains of Bitcoin and Ethereum, they're likely going to be lasting for decades, if not longer, before they become obsolete. So that's great if you have a long-term contract to store an e-signature. I don't really, frankly, trust centralized e-signature services to maintain my client's information, and I don't know if they're going to be around for that long of a period of time. But a blockchain can actually remove that functionality. I can begin to think about storing all these agreements, which are really valuable, in a more secure way. Then I can begin to automate anything that involves the transfer of an asset. So that's most of, and a large part of finance is just structuring those transfers of assets. And that's what lawyers are often tasked with, structuring them, building them, and participating in them.
Yeah, and you mentioned data security. I'm sure everyone heard about the Equifax breach. That's something that wouldn't be possible on a blockchain because there's no single point of failure. And on the blockchain, all of that data could be encrypted. If you think about it sort of as on a more macro level, they had data on every one of us in a service that we didn't opt into. And blockchain in a decentralized network, you would have to opt into being a part of that network in order for them to have access to your data. And there's a lot of decentralized identity solutions out there. There's a couple, Netkey, Civic, that are trying to solve this digital identity problem where in order to do something really simple, you have to give your social security number. They want to have blockchain-based identities where you can only provide certain amount of information, only what the service provider needs to perform that service, and share that data in an encrypted way on a blockchain. And that's another really big application that will be much more efficient and much more secure on a blockchain because Equifax clearly didn't do a good enough job taking care of everyone's really sensitive information.
So I just have a question, which isn't on the list, but as, sort of the average consumer, am I going to have to learn how to use the blockchain or?
I think that the user interfaces will be similar to any other internet application, and the blockchain will just be operating underneath. And I think, most people won't be aware that there are blockchains operating underneath the services they're using. It'll just work and it'll work better.
I just want to add, though, that using a blockchain, although a blockchain in a sense can't be hacked because it is so distributed and there's so much computational power behind it, safeguarding its record keeping essentially, that the applications built on a blockchain certainly have their own issues. They can have their own issues, similar to or even new. That's the plague sort of legacy technology from either a cybersecurity perspective or just a bad code perspective. So you probably heard of the DAO hack, where a application essentially that was built on Ethereum was hacked because the code was just not written well. And basically the way they timed the funding and transfer of assets under the DAO was such that the account was updated after the request for funds was made. So one of the hackers just found that flaw in the code and kept requesting funds, and the updating would not take place. Another recent sort of hack of an application using a blockchain was happened with a multi-signature wallet where 2 out of 3, or at least 2 out of 3 signatures need to happen. And basically the hacker there found a pretty obvious flaw in the code where they would send it a function that wasn't defined, and that would essentially allow cause the wallet to reset the parties. So just keep in mind that while blockchains themselves are highly secure from a certain point of view, or just generally speaking, the applications built on top of them may not be, and may have the same type of risks that people just need to be aware of. Again, it's not a criticism of blockchains at all. But it is an awareness of risk that still goes into applications that use a blockchain.
Yeah, I think that's right. The only point that I'd add to that is there's a slight conflation there of using a smart contract, which is the program. So there's obviously going to be bugs in programs. People are working out those issues. And then it's using it to actually anchor storage. So those are two separate things. So what's happening is people are recording a reference to documents that are being stored in a decentralized way, not on a blockchain, but on various different networks. So that is actually particularly secure. But running a program, a smart contract program, that can still have bugs. So think of it as when you first saw the internet and it was like blinking like GIFs, and it kind of looked kind of funky, and it looked kind of immature and had an immature veneer to it. So everybody looked at the internet, and some people said, this is not going to work. Other people looked at it and said, this is the best thing since sliced bread. This is going to change the world. I think we're kind of in that early stage when it comes to blockchain technology, where it's going to look a little bit funny. There's going to be a lot of new challenges, but the direction of it is it's growing at a pace that actually far eclipsed what even I expected, and I started really digging into this in about 2012. So it's been moving at an exponential rate that I think is really only akin to what we saw with the internet. So this isn't like, I don't actually think this is a lot like AI. I think it's much more akin to the internet, where this technology will just be pervasive in ways that we don't really anticipate and even really notice. So very few people understand how the internet works, but they all enjoy internet technology. I think it's the same thing. But I do think for lawyers are actually going to be in charge of building these types of agreements. So lawyers they may not need to program these smart contracts, but they will need to talk to programmers, and likely will hire programmers who can do it for them. And I think that that's what's happening. So for example, in the financial services industry, they're trying to model out pretty objectively verifiable financial transactions like derivatives. Now that's a huge portion of what most of the large financial services companies do in New York and in other financial capitals. And they want to turn that, for the most part, into code because it lowers their cost. It solves a lot of their pain points. It prevents abusive practices on the part of counterparties and a lot of problems. Just to give you a quick example of that, Ripple, which Houman mentioned, actually entered into a transaction with another company called R3 where they agreed to sell a cryptocurrency at a pretty low rate. And they didn't fulfill their end of the bargain, allegedly. And that cost R3, this consortium that was on the other side of the deal, $1 billion. If they actually embedded and used one of these smart contract programs, there would probably not be a dispute. And now it's going to wind up being a massive, massive litigation. So these are the types of issues, and these are the real pain points that are faced by financial services companies in particular, that I think are going to first get addressed by blockchain technology. Then it will bleed into all these other areas.
And just one thing for lawyers, perhaps, just maybe automating with a smart contract, collecting fees from clients, right? I mean, that's probably a major pain point for most attorneys of any kind of practice. And essentially, though, would that require putting their funds in basically in a smart contract escrow account before the provision of services is required? That could be one requirement to collateralize essentially the transaction ahead of time, and then automate the payments to the attorney, assuming, of course, the client sort of agrees with them and is not going to argue over the bill.
Yeah, I don't know if the bar associations are ready for the blockchain just yet. I think there's just a lot of, did someone put up their hand? No? Okay.
Yes.
Sure.
You prompted me to. Could you, so over the longer term, I'm pretty excited about blockchain in a variety of areas, but this is a hype versus reality. One thing that's fundamentally a challenge now is, I don't know if it's called execution time or transaction speed.
Sure.
But we're technically pretty constrained on the transaction, so there's no way that, for instance, in Equifax, 150 self-million consumer profiles. Could blockchain even reasonably support something like this, given scale in time and execution costs and other things. So
Yeah.
blockchain will scale over time to do this. That's the future. So kind of swap me out an existing system and replace it with blockchain. Today, in a lot of industries, it's a non-starter.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So I'd say we're in the dial-up phase, right? So for those who remember that, just go back to dial-up internet. It was pretty awful. But broadband was on the horizon, and people were talking about how they were going to build higher speed internet connectivity, and we have it today, right? So what we get on our phones vastly eclipses what we initially started with regard to the internet. So right now on Bitcoin, you can only add information to the database every 10 minutes or 10 to 12 minutes. On Ethereum, it's about every 10 to 12 seconds. But that time is going to get reduced down shortly on Ethereum to every 4 seconds. So in a matter of 7 years, we've gone from 10 minutes down to probably shortly 4 seconds. That's a pretty significant increase in speed. And there's a number of different proposals on ways to actually speed that up even further. So I think that similar innovation like we saw with broadband is going to happen with blockchains, and then they'll begin to eat up more and more transactions. But it's a known problem. But when you think about contracts are usually not as time dependent as like actual legal agreements. They're not usually as time dependent as things like identity or some of the other potential use cases for blockchains. So this could be an area actually where it emerges first.
That's actually one of the bigger points of contentions in some of these blockchain communities is how to scale the networks. There's with Bitcoin, one of the big watershed moments came about a month ago with SegWit, and then Ethereum's going through something similar right now. But it's something that they're actively working on because their idea is to have, any potential application that the blockchain could be helpful. They want to be able to have it be supported by the underlying ecosystem. So, there have already been incredible advancements in that arena, and there's no reason to think that they won't improve. But it might be a little bit messy as sort of these interested parties figure this out. Because it is a decentralized network. There's no CEO of Bitcoin who can say, okay, this is how we're going to scale the network. There sort of has to be these agreements, and sometimes there's a fork of the network, and some people involved in it might want one solution to scale, and some might want to do the other. But I think given time, there's no reason to think why they won't be able to effectively scale their capacity for transactions.
Okay, so we're going to shift a little bit. We're going to talk about maybe back to 2015. I don't know, but we're going to talk a little bit about data and analytics. And Susan, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you think is up on the horizon for products around data and analytics.
Well, I think it's really an exciting time to be on the product side. I think AI presents the opportunity for us as information providers to create the next generation of content tools. I think we've seen a lot of development in the litigation side, e-discovery, due diligence, litigation analytics. So I see the opportunity on the transactional side. Of course, that's kind of the world that I live in, particularly in contract drafting, creating standard contracts, being able to show what's common language, what's deviation, as well as using AI to create a statistically relevant model. I think other areas are in the area of disclosure, for instance, SEC disclosure, what are possible anomalies, what might be flagged by the SEC. Just being able to identify earlier, like where is there possible risk. So I think from my perspective, I think on the transactional side, there's tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that echoes some of what Dean has spoken about prior, which is the influence of the accounting side of things, where you're looking for those transactional variances, and I think that the analytics can be very interesting. I do want to reach out to Michael if he's listening. Michael, I don't know if you want to share. You could share what you did.
There's just, I think, in litigation analytics, there's a huge amount of data that's out there that's being used right now for strategy. There's a lot of opportunity for using it in other scenarios. I think what Mary's alluded to is I recently put together a gender diversity analytics system. So you can actually look at each individual law firms and show they're committed to gender diversity by looking at the notice of appearances that are made on individual cases. So this is kind of a different type of way of using the data that's out there that's available in litigation data. for something very different than just typical litigation strategy. It's actually be used for gender diversity commitments, and actually you can not only just do it for lawyers, you can look at companies and clients and see what type of lawyers they actually hire across industries, and to actually see if they're actually committed to gender diversity as well. You can do this, with gender, but you can also do it with any sort of diversity that you can imagine. And it's just a way of using kind of this large big data in the public realm to actually kind of get at questions other than, am I building my case or not? There's a lot of other questions that are out there that can answer with this data. So I think I see that as a big opportunity to kind of answer questions that people aren't right now asking because they don't even know that the answers exist in the data that we have.
And then, so just to open up even further on the Internet of Things, there's been a lot of panels on that, but the whole, what are the challenges that come up around that data?
Yeah, I think with a lot lots of data. If you look at in the big data area, there's structured and unstructured, and the unstructured data often comes in various different formats, and just getting the data in a similar format or a similar structure so you can do the type of analysis or analytics on it is a challenge in general. With the IoT specifically, even with the data that's structured, it's often structured in different ways because they're coming from different sensors, from different manufacturers or different IoT platforms. So even within the world of IoT, there's lots of variation. And if you look at sort of the what is big data, variety is one of the 4 or 5 V's, depending on whose school of thought you sort of go with, in addition to sort of velocity, volume, and the other V's out there. And so variety of data is a big challenge, I think, with IoT as well. But certainly coming back to the law, as sensors and sort of pervade our lives, increasingly so, you can imagine lots of different ways that IoT data is and increasingly will be used in legal practice, whether it's something like evidence, it's like I knew where you were and when you were there and that you are either guilty or perhaps innocent of a crime, or something in the civil law transactional sense, with respect to maybe contract execution. Increasingly, outside of finance as well, people are trying to, in a sense, automate the performance of contracts by tying them together with sensor data or data from IoT platforms, and that's something that clause, we're looking at in the sense of where the goods are, what condition they're in, can trigger compliance with contractual terms and conditions, and that is something I think could be very powerful in the contract area outside of finance, which to a large extent is very amenable to being digitized and automated, whether through a blockchain or not.
Right, so be turning contracts from static objects into more dynamic objects by feeding data into them and then modifying performance obligations on the fly.
Right.
So thinking about lawyers not as scribes, but more as project managers who are beginning to build out all these contingencies and clients having real-time performance obligations modified. And that's the shift that I think we're going to. That's huge, right? Think about that for a second. Like lawyers have been spending centuries just writing things down. Mm-hmm. Instead, now we're thinking about how we can actually turn contracts into pieces to manage commercial relationships in more dynamic ways.
Yeah. So in a sense, the contract sort of itself is sort of managing the relationship. It's changing in response to what's going on in the real world. So maybe a warranty term starts out at being 12 months, but because of what happens in the real world, the warranty maybe shrinks to 6 months or extends to 18 months. I mean, there's definitely commercial desirability that it would not go too long or too short within the party's interests, but that ability to sort of make contracts more dynamic than they are now is, I think, exciting to a lot of people because it does take out a lot of the friction of relationships and this sort of staleness of contracts that oftentimes are just a point in time reflection of the party's interests. There's a question, yeah.
So can you give an example of where this sort of automatic adjustment of a warranty period, like how would that be? I mean, it's easy to envision smart contracts doing financial transactions, but can you give an example?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know right now of a contract that actually has the terms, the warranty terms adjusting in response to something out there. But I could imagine if it's the case that the quality of the product the error rates or whatever it is, the defect rate of the products is higher than anticipated, the buyer will say, look, in response to having more defects in the goods than I thought I would, it maybe should have been 0, maybe it was 0.2% or 2%, I want the warranty terms and the ones I have being extended as sort of as a consequence. Because most like manufacturing supply agreements often have the acceptance of the goods, often depend on the buyer's some testing period of the goods as well. And if those failure rates turn out to be higher than anticipated, in addition to maybe a price reduction, an adjustment of warranty terms, perhaps a change in indemnification, something like that could happen where the contract is being a little bit more reflective of how parties would like to renegotiate the contract if they had the opportunity to do so, but they're sort of doing so at the instantiation of the contract. But besides that, right now, many of these agreements already have sort of dynamic price terms, which oftentimes depend on not just the general state of the markets, but oftentimes the seller's costs, right? So it's just cost plus contract, so the price is some function of the seller's costs. And that could be quite easily, or relatively easily at least, interpreted and incorporated into the contract.
And then it's not just one-dimensional, it'll be multi-dimensional. So if something happened to one agreement, it could then modify other agreements in the chain, right? So other agreements that may be dependent on that. So I think particularly with the supply chain use cases, there's lots of interdependent relationships. So you could start threading all those changes all the way through in some way. So think about like a most favored nations clause. Let's say you had that provision in place, you provided another party with more favorable terms, so it could automatically rework all those provisions without having to go through that cumbersome amendment and restatement, right? That would be a huge advantage. Who wants that, right? But you negotiated that, right? So it just creates more friction and
But can I ask a question? Like, how does that work practically? So I contract with somebody and I have a warranty of 6 months, and then all of a sudden somebody else does something and my warranty changes. How do I know that?
Oh, it would still, I mean, I would envision it still being the same seller. So it'd be your counterparty does something in the sense that they deliver goods that are more defective than you thought. So it's already agreed that if the defect rate is above a certain threshold, the warranty terms would be extended.
Okay, so it wouldn't be a surprise to me. I mean, it would be a
Absolutely
good
not.
surprise,
Right.
but.
Yeah,
okay.
exactly. Just like now, service level agreements, right? So service levels have some expected threshold, and if you don't meet the service level, then you automatically get a service level credit. I think the same approach there.
Yeah, so
we do have a question, by the way.
So it just seemed like kind of random, but now I get it.
Yeah.
I might have a beginner question about blockchain. So you mentioned using blockchain technology to help the law firms to increase the security level, to make better protect the trade secret and confidential information of the client. Could you explain a little bit more about how the law firms will be still able to control and have possession of the information or documents if they are stored in a decentralized distributed ledger?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, blockchains are anchoring like a much broader ecosystem. So think of blockchain sitting at the bottom, and they can anchor references to a document. So you can take a document and put it through a hashing function and get a unique fingerprint for it, store that on a blockchain, and then you can access that information from decentralized file storage systems that are coming on board. So some blockchains like Ethereum have native implementations. There's other projects. For example, there was a massive token sale backing a project called Filecoin, which is intending to build out a system where it takes a file, it breaks it into little tiny pieces, and it scatters it like seeds across a number of different computers. So you can never get the full piece of the document from any one party unless you have control or the authorization at a key level on a blockchain-based system. So then you sign a transaction to get that document back, it hits the blockchain, and then it threads it all the way back through to you, and then you can see the file.
So that way you can share data, files, whatever sort of form you want to describe it in a more secure way.
So, yeah, this is
than
what,
just emailing it or something.
Yeah, and this is why blockchains are not just about the ledger functionality. It's a much broader ecosystem that's being built. An entire different way to think about computing systems, from storing references to information to how that's actually pieced together. So it's much broader than smart contracts. It's just thinking about how we can manage things in a much more decentralized manner.
And in the simplest terms, it makes sure that only the people with the correct or the proper authority to view those documents can view them. That's the level of assuredness you're getting through, very sophisticated cryptography algorithms and the decentralized storage network. The attorney would be able to see the documents that they had permission to see. The client would be able to see the documents that they had permission to see. And the storage, the decentralized storage, makes it such that only those people, well, it's not a direct relationship, but essentially that's the benefit you're getting, that only the people with the proper permission, the proper key, can see the documents that have been stored within the system.
And the files are broken apart, so it's spreading the risk, right? It's similar to what we do in a lot of contexts.
And doesn't that push the problem of the security then to the key? To keep
Absolutely,
to keep
yes.
your key stored?
It doesn't resolve those key management problems, but it solves the honeypot problem that faced Equifax and faces a number of different companies.
The gentleman in the,
So is it fair to say that's the circumstances you envision lawyers or law firms using the blockchain technology to store contracts or other confidential information as just to when the law firms need to transfer the data, not that the law firms just give up the storage on their own server, instead store all the documents in a blockchain system?
They wouldn't store it on their server. So think of it as like a decentralized cloud. Yeah, so don't store it on a Dropbox, don't store it on an Amazon AWS server with specified permissions, don't serve it on an Azure instantiation, instead store it in a decentralized cloud that's much more secure.
just before we've got like 3 questions. How much does a blockchain cost? Like,
Sure.
I want to know.
So it's free. It's an
Okay.
open source protocol, so you can spin it up. Every blockchain has certain incentive systems baked in. So every time you engage in a transaction, you have to pay a fee to the parties that are adding information into this database or running computational processes. On Bitcoin, that fee structure is way out of whack. It's about like $7 per transaction now. On Ethereum, it's much lower. But it's pretty much like AWS. You have to pay for each computation, for every bit of storage that you use. That same type of model is built into a blockchain.
Okay, so
Just to give it some, an actual number, we stored something on a blockchain, like a simple document, a hash of a document. The other day it was like 27 cents.
okay, so the gentleman in the white beside the gentleman in the green had a question.
I was wondering, how do you guys see this evolving over time in terms of the erosion of the base knowledge it takes to develop some of these things? Send out the contract that there's bias that's going to be built into the systems. And like when we went from ledgers to Excel spreadsheets, and then people put the numbers in, that's just the way we did it. You look at the formula and you see the formula's messed up. So everything in that was, in succession was kind of messed up. How do you guys see that in terms of 10 years from now? Nobody knows how they got there, what their inherent problems.
I think that's a fair point. I think that's a concern, particularly since a lot of lawyers may just be relying on programmers who may not know what they're doing. I would say just developing the technology has decreased. The time necessary to develop the technology has decreased significantly. And so I think that's going to continue. So for example, programming Bitcoin actually has a very light smart contracting scripting language. It's nearly impossible to use. Ethereum has dramatically reduced the cost of that. I imagine that we're going to see other blockchains and other versions that make it even easier to do a lot of the tasks. Same thing about this decentralized storage. A year ago, it was really hard to do that. We built out pretty much an entire system from signatures to storage to smart contract execution. It took us like 2 months to build.
Is it introduce even more problems? It is so easy to put these things together that anybody kind of, or there's a lot of people who can do it.
I think it cuts both ways, like everything else. There's benefits to it and there's downsides, and we have to manage that.
Yeah, I think.
Let's not have the illusion at this point in time that contract language outside of a smart contract is consistent or simple, right? I think that one of the things that we deal with, and Susan's been dealing with this also, is that you have very complex language which seems almost designed to obfuscate rather than to do that. And I think an interesting thing as you get into more technology, you start to distill out what the intent of clauses is, and you start to get to a simplicity and standardization of that. I think the smart contracts to some extent give you that same opportunity because it's a standardization for things that really shouldn't have that much variance in it. So if you get it wrong, of course you do, but I think that there is some simplification, some benefit from that. I don't know about throw it back to
And I think there can be many forms of the standardization too. If you think of a website builder, someone without any development knowledge or coding knowledge can, through a drag and drop builder, build a pretty sophisticated website right now. Something goes wrong, someone who is a coder is going to have to go in and fix the problem and see what happens. But, in aggregate, I think it's definitely a positive that someone without an in-depth knowledge can build something more sophisticated and complex, on top of the technology. And there are going to be things that go wrong. There are going to have to be people who are experts who know how to fix them. But, I think overall, it's definitely a net positive.
Michael, I think, has a question, and then the gentleman beside.
Yeah, I just guess one of the both advantages and actually disadvantage, and kind of also in some ways an advantage of a traditional contract, is that there is ambiguity in it, right? So contracts, not all the terms are spelled out, and oftentimes parties on both sides choose not to, actually clarify every single possible term. Like, some saying using the words like reasonable behavior, or reasonable levels of X or Y. And it allows some wiggle room later. It's also can lead to litigation and bad things as well. But with smart contracts, it does. I'm not sure. Are there avenues to kind of allow for wiggle room later on, or does everything have to be 100% clear cut beforehand? And really, it's set in stone.
Yes.
If that's the case, then how do you deal with kind of the inherent inability to kind of set everything in stone?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So at Open Law, we've solved this problem. So they actually live together. So anything that can be turned into a computable contract term, we have the ability for you to do that. And everything else could just be in traditional natural language agreements. So I think a lot of people, when they look into this, they think everything's going to turn into code. That's obviously not the case. If you've ever been a practicing lawyer, you know that's not the way contracts work. But I think it's a world not of or, but one of and, right? Where you're going to have natural language provisions that work hand in hand with computable provisions. We saw this in supply chain with EDI arrangements starting in the 70s. So this is just an enhancement of what's already been out there. But once you begin to go into that mode, you can begin to reimagine commercial relationships. So you should check out our demos, but we built an employee offer letter where you don't get paid every 2 weeks, 2 weeks, you get paid every minute, right? So you can begin to imagine just having this frictionless transfer of assets, a world that's a little bit different. So why are we paid every 2 weeks? It's because the payroll processor has to go through and settle things up. And also maybe the company wants to carry the float on whatever payroll that they need to pay. But people should get paid pretty quick. Right? We wouldn't have this horrific industry of payday lenders if people actually got paid faster. And that has a significant cost to it. Same thing with managing cap tables. That's an exceptionally brutal and cumbersome process. Same thing. So we put together a basic restricted stock award that gets approved by a board of directors. So we've combined all these natural language provisions, but we have a computable provision in place which does straight vesting. So why do you have to wait to get your stock? Why don't you just get it instantaneously every minute and a fractional share once you receive it? We don't do that today because that's hard to do. But with this technology, we can begin to streamline a lot of that process. And in that process, we can reimagine what we can do commercially and what lawyers can actually be capable of putting together.
I would also add, though, that also even go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just gonna, because we're getting close to the end, so I was just going to ask for the one last question, and then everyone can give their final thought. Is that okay?
Perfect, of course.
And then afterwards, we're going to there's lots of cool companies out there. People can, chat about what we've been chatting about. But go ahead.
Great, thank you. Getting back to the decentralized file storage and assessing that through the lens of either user error or flaws in sort of endpoint security, is there an increased risk, and I understand all the benefits, but is there an increased risk of sort of irreversibly losing access to the actual content, to the files, the same way that we all read recently about Bitcoin investors getting their phone numbers hacked and then sort of people siphoning off money. There's no way to reverse that transaction. You can't call the bank and get that back. Similarly, if sort of you lose whatever that hash is or whatever you need to get to put the pieces of the file back together, you don't have any recourse, or is that not happening?
Yeah, so the hash is stored in a blockchain. So blockchains are pretty resilient and tamper resistant. So even if the underlying security of a blockchain went completely out the window, you could always reverse it back. So you'd still know where that file is in these decentralized file storage systems. I think that these systems are solving the issue related to redundancy. That's, I guess, the second piece of what you're asking. will there be enough redundant files such that if there's some failure on the part of various different computers, you can still gain access to it? My understanding, based on reading the various different approaches, is that they've thought about that and that's accounted for. The key management problems are there, but that's no different than any cybersecurity issue. But I think what's better about it is that if you have that key management issue, you're not going to lose your entire corpus of documents. Maybe you're going to lose a smaller fraction of that. That's the advantage. So it doesn't eliminate the problem, but it narrows that surface potentially, and that's what people are interested in and excited about.
Okay, so we're going to start with Susan. And if you could give a tip about if you're interested in blockchain, AI, or smart contracts, where would you go to learn more?
I think there's a very interesting blog that I've been reading, The Artificial Liar. So I'd recommend that.
Okay. Bennett?
Same question.
Same question. This is down the line, and then.
So if you're looking for one beginner resource, there's one very specific blog post that I found to be particularly helpful. If you're looking for more recurring musings on it, I'd follow Naval Ravikant on Twitter. He's the founder of AngelList. He's really smart guy. He has a lot of interesting thoughts around blockchains and where they're going.
Oh yeah, I would say. What was the blog post you were going to talk about? Sorry.
Yeah, no. So I just know it as a really long URL, and I think it's from the IEEE. But
okay.
Can you put it on Twitter?
Yeah, I can tweet it out. I can tweet it out after this because it was really helpful for me to understand.
Yeah, and there's lots of great resources. I actually think that legal tech publications are pretty good in distilling things down as they matter for practicing attorneys, if that's your point of view. Besides that, I think CoinDesk is a good source for general sort of blockchain, Bitcoin, cryptocurrency information. And then there's law firms that will have publications, again, that is focused towards the legal issues surrounding the newer technology. I think tend to be good as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'll make a slight plug. I'm publishing a book in the spring from Harvard University Press that talks about a number of these issues, provides a technical overview, talks about applications in various different areas, including applications that we haven't even talked about, like building virtual corporations and having machine-to-machine transactions. So that's kind of a subset of big data, and also running AI on a blockchain, which I think a lot of people are interested in, including IBM and other parties.
I'd actually add one more thing. If people prefer to read books over blogs or Twitter, there's a book called The Business Blockchain by William Mugayar, which is really easy to grasp, but also does not gloss over the technical details of blockchain. And that is a really good read too for anyone who's interested in more of the business and practical applications of blockchains instead of the nitty gritty of the tech.
And so I will have the final word. I interviewed Mark Oblad, who has still a legal tech company called ValQ, but he's also in-house now, and he is a lawyer who's also a programmer, and he did a lot of research and talked to many other people and created this huge paper that we turned into an interview, and so it's on Forbes in 5 pieces. So if you just Google Forbes and my name, it will show up. It was a 5-part, and it's I read it and I had to go through it, and I tried to make it user friendly for people that ask questions like my questions tonight. So that's another good source. And I wanted to thank everyone. This is a difficult subject, and I think you've made it, I've come away with a lot more knowledge. So thank you all for sitting on the panel tonight. And thank you again to Wolters Kluwer for sponsoring, and to Cardozo Law for hosting us. And there's still a little bit of food out there, and so if everyone can head out, that would be great. Thank you.